Ethan Cole didn't look like someone who belonged in a neighborhood full of polished cars, manicured lawns, and weekend garden parties. He arrived just after sunrise on a late spring morning, driving a simple gray pickup truck that had seen better decades. There were no moving trucks, no hired crew, no dramatic entrance. Just a retired man unloading his own boxes one at a time, as if he preferred it that way. At 62, Ethan carried himself like someone who had spent most of his life outdoors rather than behind a desk. His posture was straight but relaxed, his movements efficient, almost silent. Years of working as a park ranger in remote national territories had shaped him more than time ever could. To Ethan, this house wasn't a status symbol, it was a reset button. After decades of enforcing boundaries in wild forests, rescuing lost hikers, and dealing with unpredictable terrain instead of unpredictable people, he wanted something simple. A quiet yard, a place to drink coffee without urgency, a life where nothing needed to be tracked, reported, or enforced. But neighborhoods, he would soon learn, had their own kind of wilderness. The subdivision was part of a well-maintained HOA community. Brick sidewalks, identical fences, and rules for everything from mailbox paint color to grass height. Ethan read the HOA booklet once, then placed it in a drawer without comment. He had spent enough of his life following regulations written by people who had never stepped into the environments they governed. His house sat at the edge of a cul-de-sac, slightly older than the others, but solid. Behind it stretched a modest backyard lined with a wooden fence that had seen better weather. Beyond that fence lay a larger property belonging to his neighbors, the Whitmores. Ethan noticed them on his first day. Their home looked like it had been imported from a luxury magazine. White stone exterior, wide glass windows, and a backyard that seemed more like a private resort than part of a suburban block. A fountain glimmered near the patio, and trimmed hedges shaped like sculptures framed every corner of their land. Richard and Valerie Whitmore didn't introduce themselves that first day, they simply observed from a distance. Valerie was the first to speak days later, her voice carrying from across the fence as Ethan was fixing a loose board. "Oh, you're the new neighbor," she said, her tone polite but measuring, like someone evaluating furniture. Ethan nodded, "That's right." Richard Whitmore appeared behind her, sunglasses on, arms crossed. He gave Ethan's yard a slow look, one that lingered too long on the fence line. "Moving in alone?" Richard asked. "Retired," Ethan replied simply, "just wanted something quiet." Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Quiet is good, as long as everything stays in its place. Ethan didn't respond. He had heard variations of that sentence before, usually right before someone tried to push a boundary. The first sign of trouble came subtly. A week later, Ethan noticed that a portion of the grass behind his fence had been freshly trimmed, not by him. A clean, straight line cut into what he had assumed was neutral buffer space. He dismissed it as coincidence. Then came the outdoor furniture. A metal table appeared just beyond the fence line on the Whitmore side, positioned almost directly opposite Ethan's back door. It wasn't random. It was placed with intent, like someone was slowly defining territory without saying it out loud. Ethan studied it for a long moment that evening. Birds called in the distance. Wind moved through the trees, everything else felt normal. Except that something was. Still, he said nothing. Not because he didn't notice, but because men like Ethan had learned something important over time. People who test boundaries rarely stop at the first line. The change didn't happen loudly. It never does at first. It happened on a Tuesday morning when Ethan stepped out into his backyard with a cup of coffee and noticed something that made him pause longer than usual. A section of the space behind his fence, an area he had always considered part of his quiet, unused backyard margin, had been transformed. A luxury patio set now sat there. Not just placed casually, but arranged with intention. A glass-top table, 6 cushioned chairs, and a matching umbrella anchored into the ground like it had always belonged. Fresh gravel had been laid beneath it, and decorative stones bordered the edges in a neat, deliberate curve. For a moment, Ethan didn't react. He simply observed it the way he would observe a change in terrain during his ranger days, quietly, carefully, noting every detail. Then he noticed the small wooden plaque near the umbrella stand. Whitmore Private Extension, no trespassing. Ethan exhaled slowly. So it had begun. By mid-morning, Richard Whitmore himself appeared on the patio, dressed in a crisp polo shirt, scrolling through his phone like a man inspecting a completed project. Valerie followed behind him, carrying a clipboard. They looked comfortable, familiar with the space, as if it had always been theirs. Ethan walked closer to the fence but didn't step over. "I think there's been a mistake," he said calmly. Richard barely looked up. "No mistake," he replied. "We had our records reviewed." Valerie tapped her clipboard. "According to the original subdivision layout and our property documentation, this section falls under our extended boundary rights." Ethan's eyes moved to the patio again. The gravel, the furniture, the sign. "You installed this overnight?" he asked. Richard finally turned toward him, smiling faintly. "Efficient, isn't it?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. He had seen this pattern before, people building certainty first, then trying to retroactively justify it. "I've maintained this section since I moved in," Ethan said evenly. "It's been part of my property use since day one." Valerie gave a polite laugh as if he had made a small mistake in arithmetic. "Use doesn't equal ownership, Mr. Cole." Richard stepped closer to the edge of the patio, resting his hand on the chair like he was presenting it. "We're not here to argue. The HOA has already been notified. They reviewed our documents and found everything in order." That was the first time Ethan's expression shifted, not into anger but into something quieter. Assessment. The HOA. Of course. He had not yet met most of the board members, but he understood how these systems worked. Committees often favored the loudest confidence over the quietest truth, and the Whitmores had confidence in abundance. By afternoon, a notice appeared in Ethan's mailbox. Violation notice, encroachment and unauthorized land use. Attached were photographs, carefully framed shots showing Ethan's backyard fence line and the newly installed patio. The implication was clear: he was the one crossing boundaries. Ethan read it twice. Not because he was confused, but because he was confirming the direction this was heading. The next day, 2 HOA representatives visited his property. They stood near his driveway, not stepping fully onto his lawn, as if distance could preserve neutrality. One of them spoke first. "Mr. Cole, we need you to understand the situation has been reviewed. The Whitmore property line extension is legally documented." Ethan handed them no argument, only a steady gaze. "I'd like to see those documents," he said. The second representative cleared his throat. "They've already been verified by the board." That answer told Ethan everything he needed to know. Back at the Whitmore house, laughter echoed faintly from the patio that now occupied what Ethan had once considered the quietest corner of his property. Glasses clinked. Music played softly. The space had already been repurposed, not just physically, but socially. It was no longer just a dispute. It was a claim being normalized. And as Ethan stood at his back door that evening, watching the light fade across the disputed line, he understood something with complete clarity. They weren't waiting for proofs. They were waiting for him to give in. By the end of the following week, the situation had shifted from quiet tension into something far more deliberate. Ethan noticed it first in the way people looked at him. Not hostility yet, but distance. Conversations that ended a little too quickly when he approached. Neighbors who once gave polite nods now suddenly found excuses to look at their phones or step inside their homes. It was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent years reading environments where human behavior mattered more than written rules. The Whitmores had started talking. And in HOA communities, words traveled faster than truth. A second violation notice arrived, then a third. Each one more formal than the last, each one stamped with the same conclusion: unauthorized use of Whitmore property. Ethan laid them on his kitchen table without urgency. No crumpling, no frustration, no reaction that could be used against him later, just observation. The claim had become systematic now. The patio remained active. Weekend gatherings increased. Cars lined the Whitmore driveway as guests enjoyed music, drinks, and laughter directly behind Ethan's home, on land that had now been rebranded, at least on paper and perception, as an extended private entertainment zone. One afternoon, Ethan stepped outside to check his fence and found a small orange notice tied to it. HOA final warning: remove all personal items from restricted boundary. Below it, in smaller print, was a line that felt less like policy and more like pressure. Failure to comply may result in escalating fines and legal action. Ethan didn't remove it. He simply untied it and placed it in his pocket. That same evening, he received a call from the HOA office. The tone was no longer polite. "Mr. Cole," the voice said, "we've received multiple confirmations that you are refusing to cooperate with a legally recognized property adjustment." Ethan stood by his kitchen window while speaking. From there, he could see the Whitmore patio glowing under warm string lights. Shadows moved across the space, people enjoying a version of reality that was being actively enforced, not questioned. "I'm not refusing anything," Ethan said calmly. "I'm waiting for verification." A short pause followed on the line. "Verification has already been completed," the voice replied, now sharper. "At this point, continued resistance will be considered noncompliance with HOA governance." Ethan exhaled quietly. Governance, a word that sounded far heavier than it actually was in practice. When the call ended, he stood still for a moment longer than usual. Then he walked to his study. Inside, the room was simple: books, a desk, and a locked drawer that had followed him from his previous life in the Ranger Service. He opened it without hesitation. Inside were old tools of his trade: mapping equipment, field notebooks, and an outdated but carefully preserved GPS surveying device. Not new technology, but reliable technology. The kind that didn't rely on interpretation, reputation, or influence. The kind that only cared about coordinates. The next morning, Ethan began walking the perimeter of his yard. Not angrily, not dramatically. Methodically. He marked points along the fence line, paused at specific intervals, and recorded readings. His movements were steady, almost routine, like muscle memory returning after years of silence. Across the fence, Richard Whitmore watched from his patio. At first he smiled, assuming Ethan was simply documenting his loss. By the third day, the smile faded. Because Ethan wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at the ground. Measuring it. Understanding it. And for the first time since this began, Ethan wasn't reacting to their claim. He was preparing to challenge it in a way that didn't involve arguments at all. Just facts. And in a neighborhood built on perception, facts were the one thing people never prepared for. By the fourth day of Ethan's measurements, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed again, but this time it wasn't just quiet tension. It was anticipation. People had started noticing him. Not because he was loud, he was still the same reserved, retired ranger, but because of what he was doing. Every morning, Ethan walked the disputed boundary with the same calm precision, marking points, recording data, and occasionally pausing as if listening to something beneath the surface. And that alone began to unsettle people. The Whitmores, however, tried to maintain control of the narrative. That Saturday afternoon, they hosted another gathering on the patio. It was larger this time: neighbors, HOA affiliates, and a few unfamiliar faces who clearly held influence in the community. Music played softly, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the air. But the tone had shifted. This wasn't just a social event anymore. It was a display. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the patio, gesturing casually toward the disputed area like a man presenting a finalized decision. "As you can see," he said loudly enough for multiple guests to hear, "we've optimized this section of our property for community enjoyment." It was a necessary extension based on verified documentation. Valerie smiled beside him, nodding toward the guests. It really enhances the neighborhood flow, don't you think? A few polite laughs followed, a few nods, the kind of responses people give when they don't want to be the next subject of discussion. From his backyard, Ethan watched quietly from a distance. He wasn't invited, he never had been, but that didn't matter. What mattered was what he saw. The confidence in their performance was no longer just arrogance, it was dependency. They needed the space to be accepted, needed others to agree with it, needed validation to turn a questionable claim into a social fact. And that was always a fragile structure. A few minutes later, the HOA president arrived. That changed everything. He was a middle-aged man in a navy blazer, carrying a folder that looked heavier than it should have been. He greeted the Whitmores warmly, then glanced toward Ethan's fence with a brief, unreadable expression. Richard immediately seized the moment. "Perfect timing," he said. "We can finally put this matter to rest publicly." He turned slightly, raising his voice so the nearby guests could hear. As most of you know, there was some confusion regarding boundary alignment, but everything has been resolved through official HOA verification. Valerie gestured toward Ethan's side of the fence. "Mr. Cole has unfortunately resisted the adjustment, but we're confident this will be clarified soon." A few heads turned toward Ethan's house. That was the moment the HOA president finally spoke. "Actually," he said slowly, opening his folder, "there's been a development." The air shifted instantly. Richard's smile faltered just slightly. "Development." The president hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before continuing. "A secondary verification request was submitted this week." Valerie's expression tightened. "By whom?" The president looked toward Ethan's property. And for the first time, everyone followed his gaze. Ethan stood at the edge of his yard, not approaching, not intruding, just present, calm, still, observing the same way he had been for days. "I submitted it," Ethan said simply. A small ripple went through the crowd, confusion, curiosity, unease. Richard let out a short laugh. "On what basis?" Ethan didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "On the basis," he said, "that property lines don't change because someone decides they should." That sentence landed heavier than expected. Valerie tried to recover quickly. "We already provided documentation." "And I provided measurements," Ethan interrupted calmly. That was the first time the word measurements caused visible discomfort. The HOA president stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Cole has requested an independent GPS survey to confirm boundary accuracy." Richard scoffed immediately. "GPS, that's not." But he stopped mid-sentence. Because Ethan had already lifted something from the table beside him. A small professional-grade surveying device. Not decorative, not symbolic. Operational. "I worked land long before any of this became complicated," Ethan said quietly, "and land doesn't change because someone is confident enough to claim it." Silence spread across the patio. For the first time, Richard Whitmore didn't respond immediately. Because now, this wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a test. And tests, unlike conversations, always had results.